Okay, good. Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute, but we're expecting a big crowd tonight. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Library. If you'd like to put in the chat where you're watching from, feel free. It's just a little bit of entertainment while we get started. Okay. All right, looks like the numbers are leveling off. So Jane, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library, and we've got a large crowd tonight. That's great. You heard as you joined that we are recording this event, so you can share it with people after the fact. Let's see. We are happy to welcome our friends from the Lincoln Public Library tonight. It's great to have you with us. And on that note, this program is brought to you by the Lincoln Public Library and the Maynard Public Library. I'd like to thank both Friends groups for their support, and I encourage you all to sign up for your library's newsletters and support your Friends groups. I'll put a link in the follow-up email for joining the Maynard newsletter if you don't get it already. We'll be using the Q&A tonight for questions. Feel free to type them in as things come up, and Jane will answer them at the end of the talk. And one other thing, we have enabled transcription, so if you'd like to watch that, please turn it on in your controls at the bottom of the screen. Okay, I think that's everything. It's our very great pleasure tonight to welcome Jane Oneail of Culturally Curious. Jane has been here many, many times. I think 14, I'm not sure about that. It's always a delightful evening, educational and inspiring. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. She's taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. So in celebration of Black History Month, Jane will be speaking tonight about Kehinde Wiley, Color and Splendor. All right, Jane, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Kehinde Wiley. We are in for such a visual treat for tonight. And I think I can almost promise you'll leave tonight's program with a deep appreciation for who this artist is and what he has accomplished in his very young life so far. So Kehinde Wiley is, well, he was voted one of Time Magazine's top 100 most influential people in 2018, and he's generally considered a leader in global Black culture. So he kind of broke onto the scene about 25 years ago, and obviously he's been rocking it ever since. So we're going to get back to this wonderful image that's on the screen that always just makes you want to hold your head up a little bit higher whenever you see it. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our hour together. And I just wanted to give a sort of a quick shout out to some familiar faces that are familiar names that are joining us tonight. So Claudia and Susan and others, thank you for being here tonight. I'm happy to see that you're with us. So just to give you a sense in terms of how we'll break down this hour together, we're going to get started with the artist's early life, sort of the template for where he launches from, and then consider how he arrives at this signature style that he's probably best known for. Excuse my cough. And then how he breaks through with it. And then I think the joy of looking at Kehinde Wiley's work is to consider how these three things, race, power, and art history, all kind of fold in together to create these really interesting pictures and to get us thinking more deeply about all three of those subjects. And then we'll turn our attention to the subject of presidential power, because most of you are pretty familiar with Wiley's portrait of President Obama. And then for the artist that has spent so much of his life considering how to make people who are sort of disenfranchised look powerful, then he, in recent years, has considered the powerless in his artwork. So we'll just get kind of a brief look at one of his most recent exhibitions called "An Archaeology of Silence," and I think it just adds like a wonderful closed parentheses to tonight's program. So for tonight, we're really just getting a really good primer on Kehinde Wiley. His artwork, his career has exploded in so many different directions. I think that this is a good way to contain, excuse me, a lot of those big ideas. So hopefully you'll have a lot of fun going through this material. So let's get started with Kehinde Wiley's early life. So we can see him over here in a family photo. I believe this is him. He's a twin, so it's a little bit hard to break down sometimes in some of those early photos which one he is. Now he was born in 1977 and he grew up in South Central LA. Not the safest place to grow up for any of you that remember the late 80s and early 90s. He was the fifth child in a family of six kids, and they did not come from a lot of money. Now, his father was Nigerian. His mother met him when he was studying architecture at UCLA. She was there studying linguistics, but shortly after he was done with his studies, he just returned to Africa and didn't have much to do with his family. So Kehinde Wiley's mother was a single mom of six children, and sort of had to find ways to support her family. And one of the ways she did that, excuse me, was to have what Wiley described as a sort of Sanford and Son thrift shop, basically out of their house. Uh, in in uh, in real terms, she was selling a lot of furniture, antiques, tchotchkes, some of them with sort of a black sort of ethno centricity to them. And so Wiley grew up sketching these things. This was the stuff of his life that he was surrounded by. He was a very precocious child. And apparently, after watching a fair amount of Julia Child, he took over the family kitchen at the age of 10 and was cooking for everyone. We can see that he had a wonderful sense of personal style too early on, and we'll see a lot of pattern blazers going forward in his life. So his mother recognized that he had capabilities, and she wanted to keep him engaged with creative endeavors because otherwise, kind of the mean streets of South Central LA were going to eat him up. So she got him involved with art classes, and she would take him and his siblings to a place called the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Here is Wiley over here on the right in this family picture, and this is the interior of this famous museum space that's really well known for its 18th century portraiture. This is, in fact, the gallery that we're looking at the Huntington Library. And for Wiley, this was a revelation for a young boy at this particular age. He was really drawn to the technical elements of these paintings, just enchanted by it, but also really really aware that this was a depiction of class and leisure that he didn't have access to really in his life. Now, his mother's commitment to his art education actually extended to sending him to Russia when he was like no more than 12 years old. He and his twin brother headed to an art program just outside of St. Petersburg. So Wiley, at this tender young age, got to go to the Hermitage Museum, which is like 700,000 square feet of art. This is the exterior of it. And the inside was more of these like stately portraits, equestrian portraits, the kinds of things that he had seen at the Huntington, but probably times 10. So he's really been exposed to world-class art at such a young age. As a high school student, he continues on with the arts. He goes to an arts-focused public high school in LA, and he's involved in various programs, including one where he made this mural that was then shrunken down and put inside of like 2,000 different city buses. So here he is in front of this mural that he painted that's called "It Takes a Village to Raise a Child." And I was just sort of tickled by this because it's the mid 1990s. That's the title of Hillary Clinton's book. And this idea of like raising up a baby this way is very much from the Lion King movie, which also came out at that time. So cultural influences sort of seeping into his work at the time. And I will just state that this idea of a mother and child is pretty rare in his artistic output, but probably speaks to a certain extent about this huge impact that his mother had on his life. So from there, he graduates from high school and he goes to the San Francisco Institute of Art and receives his Bachelor of Fine Arts there. And then on to Yale University, where he gets a master's in fine art. And as he's studying art, there's one artist in particular that he has cited as somebody who sort of stands out in his career as being kind of a forerunner in what he did and always served an interesting model. And that forerunner was the artist Barclay Hendricks. And we see two examples of Hendricks's work here. He would typically, he did figurative work with Black subjects and almost always on a monochromatic background, like we see here. But they tend to be sort of these stylish figures that are just, they just pull you in. There's something really interesting about Hendrix's work, so much so that, you know, people like Barack Obama are collecting his work today. Now, I've actually met Barclay Hendricks before. That's a wonderful story that can be in the Q&A too, but fascinating connection for Kehinde Wiley. Now, from graduating from Yale, sort of set to take on the world, he gets this really consequential artist in residency opportunity in Harlem. And it's at the Studio Museum of Harlem. The year is 2001. He's there for 1 year. Wow, New York City in 2001. It was a year that made all the difference for him. And despite trying to dig it out in my research, I wasn't able to track down exactly when Wiley came out of the closet, but by this time he was certainly living his life as an openly gay man. So one of the first projects that he works on while he's at the Studio Museum in Harlem is this project that involves bringing in models from off the street and doing a little film project with them that he called Smile. And he simply trained a camera on these individuals' faces, all Black men, and he asked them to smile for 3 minutes. And he just keeps the camera running on them. And of course, over 3 minutes, what can start off as a natural and enthusiastic smile soon turns into something that's very forced, and then, of course, becomes something that's more like a grimace, something that's really awkward. And his mentor at the Studio Museum of Harlem said, "I can't wait to see where you go from here," because he's already delving into some pretty important ideas in American culture, and he's already using some artistic ideas from people like Andy Warhol. But basically, he's asking us as a society to kind of think about um, perhaps the fact that Black men are often portrayed as being pretty scary in American society, and asking them to smile is sort of a way to ask them to soften themselves, make themselves more approachable to the general public, and what that truly does to them, to force them into a mold that maybe isn't necessarily who they are. So this leads us all to Wiley's big breakthrough and the discovery of his signature style. So here he is still working as an artist in residence at the Studio Museum of Harlem. And he's spending a lot of time in Harlem. He's having a great time there. He's meeting a lot of people. And one day he's just walking down the street and it's sort of like Forrest Gump with that feather. This thing comes blowing up to him in the breeze, a piece of paper, and it happens to be a mugshot of a young Black man. And it gets Kehinde Wiley thinking about all of these issues, all of these things that he's been sort of ideas that have been percolating within him since he was a little boy going to the Huntington Library. These ideas about portraiture and how you can portray yourself in an exalted way versus something like this where a Black man literally has no power in how he is being portrayed. So this combination of ideas is percolating. It's coming together, and he's fascinated by this mugshot so much so that he goes on to paint it too. And this idea of like power and young Black men's power in how they portray themselves continues to bubble up inside of him. He continues to respond to this in his paintings. This is another work from 2001, and it's part of a series that he called Conspicuous Fraud. This particular image is called Eminence. And so it's pretty different from the mugshot. We've got a young man who's wearing a suit now, and we can sort of see him as though we're looking up at him. Our perspective is kind of lowered. And so in a suit, like he's supposed to be a respectable figure, right? But he's also a Black man and he has all of this hair. So his normal haircut is like expanding out beyond and around him. It's twisting and turning into these spiral forms. It's even overlapping him as a figure. In some ways, it almost seems like dark storm clouds around him. And you don't quite get a sense in terms of how he feels about this hair. But it's certainly Wiley drawing this contrast between a respectable person in a suit and a man with this wild sort of untamed hair. So once again, he's asking us to think about how we think of Black men, especially young Black men in society. So shortly after his time at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Kehinde Wiley like has this major breakthrough. He gets a little solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and he has a really cool concept for this exhibition. He paints these pictures that are very much like images of saints and angels from the Renaissance, but all of these pictures are populated by young modern day Black men wearing casual clothing. Notice that the format of all of the pictures is sort of arched as though these are figures, divine figures. We zoom into one of them and we can see, you know, the beautiful detail of this man's skin, of his modern day clothing. He's got an attribute here which recalls a Renaissance painting. Maybe the gold fleur-de-lis also recalls that painting. And of course, the format again. So we see, again, this sort of interesting juxtaposition, which calls to mind the history of painting, but also the current circumstance, the present day circumstance of young Black men. And if they don't seem right in these pictures, I mean, Kehinde Wiley's asking us, why not? Why can't we imagine them this way? Now, Wiley also plays with gender a little bit with these pictures. I think simply just putting this man on a pink background with gold fleur-de-lis sort of gets you thinking a little bit about gender. Here's just another view from that same exhibition. And you can see the two main works that you might see as you walk into the space almost look like they are lit from within. The color is so vibrant here. And here is a detail of one of those images. And so we have that beautiful golden light that sort of functions like a halo. But once again, his this sports jersey that he's wearing is kind of coming down over his shoulder. Again, there's this play of gender and the sense of many of these young Black men you would assume would be sort of traditionally masculine, and he's asking them to adopt these poses or maybe even adjust their clothing in such a way that we begin to sort of consider gender in a broader way in some of these pictures. But with this image, which I just love so much, the brilliance of these colors is just so gorgeous. And once again, he's sort of posed as though he's from a sacred Renaissance era painting, as though he is some sort of saint or the divine. And so we have this wonderful kind of floral motif and these like garland swags all around him that also kind of overlap him. Notice that the figure itself kind of blends into this background. This isn't the only figure to do so. But these images are so striking because they have these young modern men in contemporary clothing. I mean, you can't mistake where they come from, but he's blending this modern day subject with with the style from hundreds of years ago. Now, I also want to draw your attention to this image up here on the ceiling. It is a 20-foot tall painting of breakdancers, and it's simply called Go. And normally, of course, we see breakdancers on the ground spinning around, and Kehinde Wiley has thrown them up in the sky and once again has found a way to exalt them. Of course, these are all young African American breakdancers. So we see them in the sky in various positions. Some of these figures he has kind of expertly foreshortened. He's also added this kind of delicate tracery work around each one of these their heads. So once again, suggesting a kind of sainthood for each of them, or maybe even like a godlike status. There are roses also up in the air. So that's what all of these little spots of red are on your screen. And this is a modern day viewing. Of course, they're all wearing modern clothes, but look, there is also a tiny plane up there too. So in this case, Wiley is thinking of a really kind of rococo precedence for a picture like this. There was one artist in particular named Tiepolo who was like the master of the ceiling painting, and he could paint these images that make it look like your ceiling had just disappeared and you were looking straight up into the sky, and that the sky was filled with all of these figures from the world of the gods, really. So gods and goddesses that are just kind of flying around, and you see them all at wild angles too. So that's essentially what Wiley is handing us here, once again, with modern day subjects. Now, interestingly, his sort of a reinterpretation of this early painting Go has been turned into a stained glass window, and it's now permanently installed at Penn Station in New York City. Wiley said, I wanted to create at the intersection of trade, commerce, and transportation in the capital of the world's economy, something that sits as a testament to Black possibility. But believe it or not, up until this point, Wiley has still not officially arrived at his signature style. And he gets there um, first with going out on the streets, going out on the sidewalks, meeting as many people as he can, and essentially doing what he calls street casting. It's a little bit of a hustle. There's certainly an element of chance here. He loves that element of chance. It's sort of like that mugshot blowing by him on the sidewalk one day, just capturing it and being fascinated by it. So street casting is essentially a way to find models. And of course, early on, it was kind of difficult to convince young Black men to go to his studio to model for him. Most of them, A, didn't believe that he was an artist, or B, thought they had to pay to be a part of it. But these days, it's much easier because he's a global phenomenon. So the New Yorker magazine said that Kehinde Wiley excelled at the art of the pickup line. He would say things like, I'm an artist and you're a work of art, and essentially convince at first just young Black men, but later on women too, to go back to his studio. And early on, what he would do would be to show them his collection of art books. And he would say, you know, choose a painting, choose a pose, and I will paint you like that. So somebody that he cast from the street might go back and find a painting like this. Not necessarily a standout work in the history of art. This is painted by the artist Franz Hals. I'm not going to say it's a bad painting, but it's not one that everybody learns necessarily as they go through their art history training. And maybe his model might say, this is the pose. This is who I want to be. And so then Kehinde Wiley paints them. And the pose stays pretty consistent between the two paintings, but let's talk a little bit about what has changed here. First of all, pretty obviously, the clothing has changed. He has a modern day subject, and he puts them in their own clothes. And for Kehinde Wiley, it's really important to him to get the clothing right, like right down to the little details and the logos and that sort of thing. So this is like a Sean John leisure suit. These are Timberland boots here. And Wiley recognizes that, you know, these outfits might be completely out of style within 5, 10, 20 years after they're painted, but capturing who these people are and the details of how they put themselves together and present themselves to the world is really important to them. So we've got the clothing. Also, the color in Wiley's painting is so much more vibrant, right? The colors sort of pop off of the canvas, and part of that is the racial identity of the figures. So obviously we're going from figures of power that almost exclusively feature white men to figures of power that now feature young Black men, people who in America traditionally don't have that much power or wealth. And then finally, we've got this incredible color in the background. The background has dramatically changed from its original source material. Wiley doesn't really care about showing estates or other major attributes of wealth. Instead, he kind of pushes his subject right up close to the picture plane with this flat background that has this rich ornamentation to it. And sometimes it's kind of rococo, sometimes there are other eras or sources for this material, but it tends to be flat decorative patterning. And it almost always crosses in front of the subject too, almost like intertwines with them. And there's a lot of different ways to understand why he might be doing that. I don't think he's ever given like a clear, concise answer about it, but I think in it's fun to sort of speculate. Is it the relationship between the subject and society, the artist and society? I mean, there's all these relationships that kind of overlap and underlap here. Now, if we look really well, let's sort of briefly just look back for a second and see how things have changed in just a short amount of time. And I think one of the biggest differences is now that Wiley has kind of found his signature style, one of the big differences is that he lets his subjects choose their poses. So there is this sense of ownership, of authenticity, and of true confidence and kind of swagger in these signature style portraits, like the one on the right over here, as opposed to somebody who's like affecting the pose of a model over on the left. So there's this wonderful sense of like the possibility of who these young men are, especially once you place them in this field of power, which has traditionally been relegated to white men. And then, of course, if we look back just a little bit further, we can see that that idea has sort of just been there from the beginning with with things like the curve and curl of this extra long hair that he has over here, kind of making up the background and even curling in front of him just a little bit. And then finally, we see a little bit of it in those images from the Smile films, where Wiley is thinking about really this ultimate question of making young Black men, sort of softening them, making them appealing to the world at large. How do you change the way they are viewed in some ways so that it is I it, I hate to say it, in some cases safer for white audiences. And of course, if you're painting, you are thinking about white audiences quite a bit because they're a big part of the art market. So Wiley has stumbled upon this wonderful solution to kind of all of these problems that he's been digging through for the past few years with the portrait that we see on the right. And one last element to it that is worth noting is this issue of scale. You can see that this is a major painting. It's on a grand scale. It's like a life-size form, and it stops you in your track when you see it. It's a delightful painting, but it's also heroic. And so I think it's the kind of painting that always holds the wall with the realism there too. There's this wonderful sense of splendor. It feels like something that's old world, but at the same time, it feels very familiar. So now we get a sense in terms of the appeal of Kehinde Wiley's pictures. We love to see things that are referential. We love a good remix. We love mashups and sequels. That's the reason why all the movies that are put out these days are sequels, because we gravitate towards things that are already in some way familiar. So Kehinde Wiley's paintings are I mean, I think you can make the case that they are like an art historian's dream because they provide the opportunity to always go back to the source material, to always do the compare and contrast. And so, if you ever took an art history class in college, you probably had those two slide projectors in the back of the room at some point. And this was a tradition going back essentially 100 years with the ideas of the Swiss art historian Heinrich Wolflin, that art history is really about putting two images up together and doing a side by side compare and contrast. This is like the very essence of art history. And dear Kehinde Wiley is like offering us this like softball opportunity to do just that. And it's so satisfying. So he is in some ways creating paintings that are right there for art lovers and for people that study art. And I think with this referential element to his paintings too, offering up something that feels familiar in some way. So he's astutely aware of his audiences and creating things that really speak to people too. Now, in terms of finding these source materials, I think it's interesting to share that Wiley once said, "The original painting can be total crap. As long as it's a great pose," he said, "nobody's going to be looking at the source," which I find really funny because, like I said, I think his paintings are so much about doing the compare and contrast. But I would agree with him. It doesn't even have to be a great painting, it's just about the pose. So, with that, Kehinde Wiley becomes the court painter to Black America. And he is extending this canon of art history now to include Black and Brown people who, for millennia, really have been shut out of this process. And clearly, he is filling a void, he's filling a need. I'll share a brief story from my experiences teaching art in museum galleries. Um, it right here in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I'm from, at the Currier Museum, when we'd have children from like schools that were more diverse, we'd bring them into the European gallery, and it was really hard to get them to connect with images of nothing but white people. But I remember on one tour, there was a little girl who loved all of the bronze sculptures, and she was like essentially dragging me over to the bronze sculptures because to her that was Black skin and it felt familiar. And we all want to see something familiar in this world, right? And that is why you get wonderful pictures like this of people really responding to these pictures, people channeling these pictures and doing their own impressions of the pose. We are all drawn to things that look like us and reflect our experiences. Now, one of the criticisms that sort of goes along with this, not necessarily of Kehinde Wiley, but I'll share it with you. This is an April Fool's article from the online art magazine called Hyperallergic. And it says 100% rich and white museum staff announced that they've successfully combated racism. We did it. We really did it. And the first line of the article says, citing a purchase of a single Kehinde Wiley painting, the entire white staff of the local museum congratulated themselves on solving racism this week. And so, what we see a lot in the world of museums, what is happening is the commission of a single Kehinde Wiley painting or the purchase of one to respond to what is already in their collection. And of course, this is not solving racism by any stretch of the imagination, but it is asking people to think differently about these objects. So going back to the Huntington Library, where Kehinde Wiley was a little boy and had his really first experiences with 18th century portraiture, Wiley just a few years ago was commissioned to create a work for that gallery of 18th century painting. And he recalled that when he was a little boy, the picture that resonated the most with him was this Gainsborough painting of the little blue boy from the 1770s. And the reason it resonated was because it was another little boy. You know, they might not have much in common, but they were both children. So Gainsborough's little blue boy has been kind of a cultural phenomenon going back to the time when it was first painted. Art historians love to kind of debate this whole challenge of having warm and cool colors in a painting. When it was brought to America 100 years ago, it was already an international sensation. So Wiley was asked to create something in response. So we've got Gainsborough's Little Blue Boy, who's wearing this like incredible like satin ensemble here with the bows on his shoes and the feathered hat in his hand, this very confident pose with little curls down the back of his neck. And in response, Wiley gives us this young man, and it's called Portrait of a Gentleman, who's wearing I think these are like denim shorts here and a tie-dyed shirt. He's got uh, bleached dreadlocks here. He's also holding a hat in his hand and sneakers on his feet, and a sort of cocky, confident pose as well, with his wrist flexed and his hand on his hip, or resting on his hip in this way. Wiley takes away any of the traditional background, these sweeping views that you might see in an 18th century portrait, and he flattens it out with this decorative patterning. In this case, a little bit of blue to recall that original work, and then these wonderful orange flowers, which tie right into the tie dye of the young man's shirt. And this picture was placed right there in the gallery with the other 18th century pictures. What's so great, I just love this because I showed this picture to an audience in person the other night, and people gasped when they saw it that this picture would be included with these images. But it's all about having a dialogue with these works, and what's sort of in keeping with them and what's the big departures here. One of the really smart decisions that Wiley made, at least in my estimation, is that he opted for the same kind of ornate frame, except his frame is painted black. He said, I'm trying to allow for even the presentation of the painting to take on the nature of its meaning. And so he's essentially saying that I'm here, these men are here, we're significant, but we are different. So with that, we're going to shift gears and take a look at some of Wiley's paintings that speak to art history, race, and power. And so this is probably his best known painting. It's called Napoleon Leading the Army Over the Alps from 2005. It's at the Brooklyn Museum in New York City. And of course, it is a reference to the famous Jacques-Louis David painting from 1801 of the same title. I will tell you now, though, that Kehinde Wiley's painting is actually more Googled than the original source painting. So it's a wonderful example of how Wiley reimagines the way Black people are depicted in art. And he's giving this Black subject all of the authority, all of the power of somebody who was an empire builder like Napoleon over here, rearing up on this wild steed, holding onto the reins with just one hand. We see that in both pictures, and raising his hand high in this authoritative, calm, relaxed pose. It's pretty extraordinary. So to place a young Black man in that position is certainly giving him a power and a central focus that up until this moment in the history of art, Black men were never afforded. And there's wonderful little details here, like the fact that this young man is wearing fatigues, he's wearing camouflage. So there's still this sense of a military connection here. He's got this wonderful, very vivid yellow cape that flows out behind him. And instead of the Alps in the background, we have this incredible, very deep red background with this damask patterning there, which feels like it's there's like this richness to it. It feels like the wallpaper of a European palace. So there's all these signifiers of wealth and power surrounding this young man who looks like somebody that you might see walking down the street of any city in America today. So Wiley's playing with our expectations and he is exalting his young Black subject here. By the way, this young man's last name was Williams. We can see it over here in the rock as opposed to Bonaparte. And as I understand, he was the person that chose to be on horseback here. uh, some little wonderful details and interesting details. David painted his signature onto some of the harnessing for this horse, as did Wiley over here on the right. Now, Wiley was really interested in particular about um, discussions of Black masculinity. And so one of the interesting things that he did was he included references to, or images really, of sperm throughout the background of this picture and many other pictures from this era. He even included it in elements of the frame there. So he's really asking us to consider the strength, the virility of these Black men that he's painting. Going right along with that and keeping with the subject of Napoleon, we have the update of another Napoleon portrait, this one done by the French artist Ingres, from right around the same era. This is Napoleon enthroned over here from the early 1800s, and this is Wiley's update on it with the rapper and actor Ice-T. And so the original painting is one of the most mesmerizing, knock your socks off images in terms of its realism and its references to power. Napoleon, crowned with these golden laurel leaves, holding these royal scepters, draped in this red velvet robe that's lined in ermine, on top of a throne that also has an eagle on it. I mean, it's like the references to wealth and splendor do not end. And then to take a man who is probably best known at this point in his career, at least, as a rapper, and place him in that same kind of splendor. I love that his chin is kind of turned up here too, kind of recognizing what he's taking on in this moment, and embracing the role of, I can be just as powerful, or I am just as powerful as any world leader or world builder that might have come before me. Here's just a quick photograph of Ice-T with Kehinde Wiley. This was incidentally commissioned as part of, believe it or not, a VH1 awards show. So Wiley did several portraits of prominent rappers from the time. Another rapper that he painted, and this picture is now in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. This is the rapper and actor LL Cool J. And this is like such a knockout in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. I remember seeing it years ago and was just mesmerized by it. So we see this young man who at this time is already sort of an icon within the Black community. And he's wearing this beautiful white suit here, but also the black vest and the brown vest and the brown hat. We're looking up at him, and he's looking down at us from this beautiful wooden chair with this sense of incredible confidence. And all of this kind of clashes with this very bright, vivid patterning that's happening in the background. Notice too, up in the upper right-hand corner, there's like it looks like a family crest, but in this case, it's just something invented to honor LL Cool J. It includes the hat and the boxing gloves that he wore in one of his famous music videos. Now, in this case, LL Cool J actually chose the source material to a certain extent. He had just read a biography of John Rockefeller that was written by Ron Chernow. So he said, paint me like Rockefeller. And as it happens, Rockefeller had been painted by the artist John Singer Sargent. And Kehinde Wiley used that as his source material. Notice the white pants, sitting in a chair facing the right, but even the way the fingers are splayed with one hand and then held in a fist with the other one. Whenever I look at this Rockefeller portrait, he looks so old, he looks so feeble. He was, of course, at one time the richest man in the world, but that isn't necessarily signified by the pose or the surroundings. And yet Wiley is able to update that, making LL Cool J look like, a mogul in comparison. So imbuing all this power into this young man, and here's just a view of it in the gallery. Again, it's on a grand scale. It stops you in your tracks. There's something just like immediately accessible about it, and just kind of wonderfully delightful. So Wiley then goes on to take on sculpture too. Sometimes his work is of the moment, sometimes it seems to be a little bit prophetic. But in 2016, I believe, he went and visited Richmond, Virginia, and he was really taken by this kind of hipster town that was punctuated with all of this Confederate statuary. So, in response, he creates this work called "Rumors of War." I just want to quickly show you what Richmond, Virginia looked like really up until just a few years ago. There's this major thoroughfare that's called Monuments Row that is punctuated by huge equestrian portraits of Civil War Confederate soldiers and generals. And so this particular monument here of General Lee, which we see in the middle of the photograph on the right, is 60 feet tall. So it really exalted the losers of the Civil War, sort of inexplicably, I think, to our modern eyes. So Wiley thought, I'm going to take one of those sculptures, the sculpture of Jeb Stuart, a Civil War Confederate general, a depiction of him on horseback. He was known as a particularly effective equestrian soldier, and I'm going to update that in turn, use essentially the same horse, the same pose for the horse, but make the rider a young Black man. Now, just a little bit of background: this portrait or this equestrian sculpture of Jeb Stuart was done in 1907. And so, several decades after the Civil War. And when it was unveiled in Richmond, it attracted somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 people. It was like a week-long party. There were 18,000 Confederate soldiers who camped out in celebration uh, of this new sculpture. And as I looked at this photograph that I just kind of stumbled across, I couldn't help but notice this Black family that was sort of moving through the crowd. I'm going to zero in on them for just a moment. There's a woman here, a younger child, and then even a younger one whose face that we can't see, but we can see that all of their hands are together in this kind of knot to keep them safe. How scary it must have been for them, for these people to be celebrating these Confederate generals in the early 20th century. So Wiley thinks, I'm going to take not just one subject here who I'm going to convey in this sculpture. I'm going to use facial recognition software and take the faces of 6 Black men who have been I think almost all of them were killed by police officers, and combine them into one portrait and put that face on horseback and put them in a position of triumph here. So this young man, he's got the distinctive hairstyle with the dreads sort of up in a knot on the back of his head. He's wearing a hoodie, he's wearing Nikes, and he looks majestic in his own right, rearing up on the back of this horse. This sculpture was first unveiled in New York City. You can see the crowd that attracted it in New York City. This was 2019. It now sits outside of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts permanently. They wrote on their website that this sculpture offers an exquisite example of how to imagine and develop a more complete and inclusive American history. And of course, now all the other monuments on Monuments Row have been since taken down. So let's turn our attention now to an interesting challenge in the course of Kehinde Wiley's career, and that was the challenge of painting President Barack Obama, because this is an artist, of course, who has been focusing his entire career on people who have been disenfranchised, people who have been marginalized, people who have had essentially no power in the American system. And now he gets to paint a picture of someone who actually wields it. How's he going to handle this? Well, let me just get the elephant in the room out of the way. The Homer Simpson meme of him backing into bushes awkwardly is the perfect meme in response to President Obama's portrait here. But it has been said that Obama's portrait is not what you would expect, and that's why it's great. It is a very big deal, especially in the sense that it is a portrait of America's first Black president by the first African American artist to paint a presidential portrait. So just those two things make it so important. And so Wiley is has to negotiate President Obama's desires for this picture. He said he wanted to be like a man of the people. He said he believed in power from the bottom up, and um, and he liked the way that Wiley could elevate the average person to make them look like nobility. Now, just as a reference point for us, presidential portraits obviously have been painted going back to the very beginning of our country. And for the most part, they are pretty somber affairs. A lot of black, maybe a little bit of red. Sometimes they're standing, sometimes they're sitting, but they're really never, for the most part, there's very little artistic innovation or vision there. It's oftentimes just showing the man in the office of the presidency. And Wiley said he wanted to do something different. Now, just to give us sort of the bigger frame of reference here, we do have one female artist, Elaine de Kooning, who painted JFK. And then over on the right, I also wanted to share Bill Clinton's portrait, which was done by the artist Chuck Close. But really, those three portraits are kind of standouts in the history of presidential portraiture. It's also worth noting too that at the beginning of the country, a few of these presidents at the beginning were slaveholders, and then by the time Barack Obama's portrait is painted, I mean, he is married to the great great granddaughter of a slave. So it's really this opportunity for Wiley to kind of tell the bigger story of what's happening in America. Now, a little bit more context too is that each presidential couple has at least two official portraits painted. These are two other portraits that were painted of the Obamas. These are painted for the White House context. The one painted by Wiley was for the National Portrait Gallery. So as we zoom in here, just a few sort of nuts and bolts about this particular portrait. Obama said he wanted to be relaxed, as I said, sort of like a man of the people. He's not going to look stiff in this portrait. He was very self-deprecating, very humorous when it was unveiled. He said he tried to convince Wiley to give him less gray hair and smaller ears, but quote Wiley's artistic integrity would not allow that. When photographing the former president, Wiley was trying to pose him, oftentimes sort of in the guise of some of these other young men that he posed before. And finally, President Obama was like, you know what, just let me do this, and essentially slid into this position with his elbows on his knees. And that was it. Excuse me. Just gonna take a sip here. So so Wiley said in retrospect, yeah, I should have let President Obama take over this from the beginning. So we see him here in a suit, relaxed, no collar, or sorry, no tie, open collar, but we can see his Rolex watch here. Now, typically when a presidential portrait, oh, and I should mention too, all of the flowers surrounding him are flowers that signify important places in the life of the president. So yellow chrysanthemums, relating back to the city of Chicago. There are other flowers that relate back to his time in Hawaii, other flowers that relate to his father's origins in Kenya, and so on. So Wiley said that instead of showing the office of the presidency, he really wanted to kind of track the life of President Obama here, which I think he does in a really interesting way. There are some people too that think that being surrounded by bushes this way is a little bit of a play on words, because certainly he's sitting in front of bushes, and he came right after the Bush family in the White House too. So normally unveiling these portraits is a pretty small sort of staid affair. It's just kind of a ceremonial thing, but it became a huge event with big audiences because there was such an interest these innovative portraits that were made by Wiley and Amy Sherald for Mrs. Obama. And uh, just to quote President Obama very quickly, who both of the Obamas were given portfolios of like 20 different artists. They narrowed it down to about 3 or 4, interviewed them, and then decided from there who they would work with. Obama said, I was always struck whenever I saw Wiley's portraits by the degree to which they challenge our conventional views of power and privilege. The way he would take extraordinary care and precision and vision in recognizing the beauty and grace and the dignity of people who were so often invisible in our lives. He put them on a grand stage, on a grand scale, and forces us to see them in ways they were so often not. And then he went on to joke that he had to explain, please do not make me look like Napoleon. He said, I get enough political problems as it is. So apparently the artist and the president had kind of a bonding moment because they were both the sons of African men who were not really a part of their lives. So there was a connection there that I think both of them deeply felt. And Wiley got up afterwards and thanked his mother in particular with tears in his eyes for making sure that he had paints when he was a little boy, for making sure that he could get out of South Central LA. He said, "You saw it, you did it, and thank you." So I'll just wrap up with this and say that he also said, Mr. President, thank you for giving me a chance and for giving this nation a chance to experience your splendor on a global scale. So these paintings include, Wiley's painting and Amy Sherald's painting actually tripled the museum's attendance at the National Portrait Gallery following their installation. And then they went on a 5-city tour and drew hundreds of thousands of more people. Here in Chicago at the Art on the Mart event program, you can see that they were actually even, they lit up a building there. So these pictures clearly mean a lot to a lot of people, and they set Kehinde Wiley's career on a whole new trajectory. The following year, he was featured on the cover of Vanity Fair for their portraiture issue. I don't know if he really loved being in the armor, but it kind of speaks to his kind of work. Now, very quickly in our last few minutes, I just wanted to give you a little glimpse in terms of what he's been doing lately. This exhibition called An Archaeology of Silence speaks to really came about through his experience watching the death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, living through COVID. So instead of painting young Black men in sort of regal poses, now he's essentially having them lie down. He's putting them on the floor, and he's still referencing great works of art. This is his sculpture, inspired by the Greek work, The Dying Gaul, dating back to the early years, dating back millennia really. And so the dying Gaul, of course, is a dying figure on the ground who's like twisting in response to his pain. Wiley shows him, updates him, fully dressed with a hooded sweatshirt draped over his head. So we can't quite see his face, but we understand that there is pain, that there is suffering there. And I think for many of us, the hooded sweatshirt reminds us of the young boy, Trayvon Martin, who was sort of singled out and targeted because he was wearing a hoodie sweatshirt, and who was ultimately killed by someone who proclaimed to be part of the neighborhood watch. Now, to keep this sculpture kind of in keeping with Kehinde Wiley's work, we can also see that there's like this vegetal element that's kind of twisting around his leg there. So those floral motifs that we see in the background kind of come up from the ground in some of his sculptures. These works were inspired and actually by a painting by Hans Holbein that you can see here. It's this long, exaggerated version of Christ entombed. He's looking garish, and like his skin is sort of putrefied here, but Wiley interprets that or reinterprets it with the body of a young Black man who's presented sort of serenely, but sort of unmistakably almost in like a coffin-like setting. And so we are forced to kind of do this juxtaposition between the divine and the very human, and thinking about a life that's been taken far too soon. Now, in this exhibition, he presents work on a grand scale. We can see a figure standing here with a sculpture that looks, to be almost like 20 feet long, and a painting that's even bigger. And all of these bodies on the ground, of course, are making us think of state violence and surveillance against Black figures in American society. But of course, his focus here is also global at this point. And he's updating sculptures, once again, still playing with gender. This is a famous sculpture from the 1600s of St. Cecilia. And he uses that same pose, not just for Black figures here, but also for female figures. And it's such a powerful position, really, too, to have a body twisted in this way, where where they do feel lifeless, where once again, where we don't see their faces, and Wiley provides all this other information about who they are, down to like the details of their sneakers and the way their hair is done. So we're really considering who they were, and what their lives were made of. And of course, intersecting all of this, enveloping all of this with these incredibly vibrant colors in the background that sort of speak to, life still springing forth, even though these bodies may seem lifeless in the moment. The showstopper is another equestrian portrait, this one called specifically An Archaeology of Silence, where instead of a triumphant rider, we have a young man who's sort of been thrown over the saddle here. It's essentially the same horse that we saw with Rumors of War, but now our writer almost appears lifeless. And once again, the details of his face, of his hair, are breathtaking. It's an unusual portrait for him because he doesn't have all the details, all the wonderful details of the clothing that we so often see with Wiley's portraits. But it seems like a fascinating bookend to the man who became known for the celebratory equestrian portraits, to now end on this tone. Not end, this is just a stopping point in our examination today, with taking something from like visionary and exalted to the solemnity and the recognition of where things stand in terms of current events in America today. So on a happier note, we will end with this last glimpse of Wiley here in one of those great jackets, and just a few quotes from him too, because he said his career was really focused on addressing and remedying the absence of Black and brown men and women from our visual, historical, and cultural narratives. He said, growing up as a kid in South Central LA and going to museums LA, there weren't too many people that looked like me in those museums. My purpose as a painter has been to project out into the world this urge, this itch, this desire to see something corrected. And to his credit, have been many artists that have kind of followed very closely in his footsteps. This is a work by the artist Titus Kaphar, who also looks at the art historical canon and reinterprets it through the lens and through the perspective of Black and brown people. This is a photographer, a Kenyan photographer, who uses these bright, vivid colors in order to do Black figurative work like we see over here. And Wiley has done remarkable things in terms of creating artist in residency programs. There are at least two of them in Africa right now, maybe one in the US as well, that are luxury accommodations in order to support the work of living artists today. So I'll end with just one last quote from him, because he describes this so well. He said, "It seems silly. You're taking this hairy stick and nudging things into being, but it's not. This is consequently who we as a society decide to celebrate. This is our humanity. This is our ability to say, I matter. I was here." And clearly, his paintings let his audiences feel that way as well. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Wiley's work. I'll do my best to answer them. So I'll start looking at the Q&A here. Oh, had he intended go to be hung on the ceiling is the first question from Susan. Thanks, Susan. That goes back to those break dancers that we saw before. Yes, the intention was to hang it on the ceiling, and he was like using perspective in a way that was pretty similar to Tiepolo there, foreshortening those bodies, which is a really tricky thing to do in order to get that same effect. Mishi says, regarding the topic of vibrant colors in his work, I have learned that many of these notable works from the past were much more vibrant than they are now. Would that be true for the figure balancing a sword on a burgundy background? Would the colors have been much more vibrant when it was completed? And so the vibrant colors from Kehinde Wiley are truer to form than we might expect. That's a really interesting question. If we go to this comparison, which I think you're referencing here, so maybe the red curtain would have been really much brighter when it was originally painted. That could very well be the case. But I think that I'm guessing that Wiley's intention is to go for even brighter. It's good of you, Mishi, to point this out because it gets us thinking about what did these works look like historically. And of course, Wiley is deep into the history of all of these things. So I'm glad that you brought up this issue. And just my guess is that he always wanted for a little bit more vitality, but that's just my hunch. Thank you for the question. Janice asks, what is the significance of the flat decorative backgrounds in Wiley's work? Janice, that's a great question. I think in part, they separate the new painting from the original source, and they put it in what many art historians have described as a new field of power. They're references to beautiful things, to decorative things, to things that seem like they are rich and valuable, and with that dense patterning there, but they are not references to things that are owned or possessed, like an estate that you might see in the background of an 18th century portrait. So there's a richness and a lushness to the display there that is wonderful. It's visually arresting. I think it draws you in, but it doesn't have the same suggestions of the exact same suggestions of wealth and opulence that you might have seen in an 18th century picture. So I think it's just his way to update it, and to get us thinking in new ways. I guess I don't have like the easiest, quickest answer for that, but I mean they're enchanting, aren't they? So many of those background patterns. And they're absolutely lovely. And I think we all kind of have different reference points for them too. I don't think it's ever like one specific thing that we're supposed to understand it to be, but it's defiantly not what's in the source material. Mary asks, does he have assistants help him with the painting and the incredibly detailed backgrounds? Mary, thank you so much for asking that question. There are a lot of assistants. This is like almost like a machine process at this point. So he had, I think he still has a studio in China. I think he still has a studio in Brooklyn. And so sort of like a Renaissance master today, or like a Renaissance master working, 500 years ago, he's really only responsible for painting the face and the hands of the figures at this point. With the Obama portrait, he painted the whole thing, and it took him about 2 years, juggling other projects, of course. But the process by which he arrives at these pictures today is very different than the original imaginings. And so he really only is responsible for a small portion of it. And so he has assistants that specialize in the background. He's got assistants that specialize in the camera work in the beginning, other people that do the costumes. And so it's a well-oiled machine, and they can produce about 20 of these types of paintings a year, and they can sell for 7 figures. So he's making a lot of money. Mishi said, one is in view in San Diego, if anyone is in that area. Thanks for adding that and the link to it. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mary, for your kind words. Let me switch over to the chat. Oh, Mary, you're so sweet. Let's see here. Barclay Hendricks recently added an exhibit at the Frick. Yes, thanks for adding that, Mary, too. Barclay Hendricks is sort of like all the rage these days. So putting in those wonderful like 1970s, 1980s figurative paintings along with those wonderful like Rococo paintings at the Frick. A great kind of counterbalance there, something that you see a lot being done with Wiley's work too. And then Sally, thanks for adding that the MFA apparently has one on view as well. Bianca says, special note of thank you for an outstanding presentation. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Bianca. Such kind words. Thank you very much. And from Leanne and Mary and Susan, I always appreciate it. It's such a pleasure for me to put these together. So thank you for sharing your day and learning a little bit more about them. I think we got to everything. I love that people are sharing the Wiley paintings that are near them. That's really fun. He has an extensive website too. You can see all these different exhibitions that he's put together, all of these different kind of sources too that have inspired him over the years. And he's just a fascinating person in general. So I mean, he's only what, about 46 years old at this point. So I am sure we're going to see so many more fascinating things from him. He doesn't want to be defined simply as the painter of Barack Obama. So I think he's going to continue to challenge himself along the way too.
Jane, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. Probably a lot of us have not seen a lot of these works, so new to us, and you're a wonderful guide. I'd like to point out for people that came to Jane's talk about Faith Ringgold, there's an exhibit at the Worcester Art Museum, and I know the Maynard Library has a Worcester Pass, probably Lincoln does as well. So take the opportunity to get to see her stuff close up.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for putting up with my cough, everyone.
Jane, it's been a wonderful night. Thank you from Maynard and from Lincoln, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Sally. Have a good night, everyone.
Night, everyone.